Good morning. I'm Linda Feldman, Washington Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor. Our guest today is Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, Chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and this is his third appearance at a Monitor breakfast. The first was back in 2004 when he was Governor of Virginia, and then as a senator 4 years ago, Senator Warner joined us as Vice Chair of Senate Intelligence and gave us an absolutely fantastic tutorial on cybersecurity. And I was looking back on my notes from then, and he promised to come back, so I'm really happy he's kept his promise, because now he's both Chair of Intelligence and also member of Senate Banking, and thus sits right at the heart of many of the biggest news issues of the day. And so, needless to say, we're delighted to have you here today. And now I will give you the ground rules. We're on the record, but please no live blogging or tweeting. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. And once the session ends at 10:30, there's no embargo. And we have a photographer here taking pictures, and we'll send them out to everyone here as soon as the breakfast ends. As many of you know, if you'd like to ask a question, please send me a signal, and I will call on as many of you as time permits. Now, Senator Warner, if you'd like to make brief opening remarks, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you all for coming out. I did indicate I'd be back. I didn't think it would take 4 years and a COVID issue to deal with to make that interim. Again, first of all, I bring you greetings. I don't know if any of you went last night. I went to the Kennedy Center Mark Twain Honors. I think it was the longest on record. And I cannot imagine it's going to be on CNN like next week. And it was kind of a mix. It was Adam Sandler was the honoree, and I got no idea how they're going to take this 3-hour plus show and get it into 2 hours that can appear on CNN. They're going to have to bleep out about every third word. But interesting evening. Let me just opening comments. I know we've done this. I've done this before. Everybody's got questions, but I guess what I'm thinking about this week, as we think back with some of the stories over the weekend about 20 years after the invasion of Iraq, and where our country's foreign policy went with its kind of obsession about anti-terrorism, where I think in his historical standpoint, we took our eyes off the ball a bit in terms of great power competition. And while banking and Trump and AMFs and what have you may be the story this week, I think the story that is going to be not only this week but for the coming months and potentially years is our competition with Russia and China in particular. I think it's also extraordinarily important that as a policymaker, I make clear all the time that our beef is with the Communist Party and Xi Jinping's leadership. It is not with the Chinese people, because failure to do so simply plays into the CCP's propaganda that it will consequently appear on WeChat. What's happening this week in terms of the Xi-Putin meetings and the ramifications if Xi leans in more on selling arms to Putin could be really transformational. I think about this in the context of starting in 2017 on a bipartisan basis. I've done a series of these classified roadshow briefs where me and a Republican senator with leaders of the intel community take industry after industry by sectors and talking about the challenge with China. Candidly, the first, we did, I think, 14, 15 of them before COVID. We've done 4 or 5. The most recent one last week with the BRT. And to see the change in mindset where people were kind of didn't want to hear the message of private equity even at first before COVID, wouldn't even take a meeting because they were making so much money off of Chinese tech. That has changed, although even as recently as last Thursday, we had 40 plus BRT CEOs in, and there were some who were saying, this stuff with Taiwan really is not going to bubble up, is it? And I think we may have dissuaded them from that view. And what I'm trying to do with the Intelligence Committee, and I'll wrap this up because I know we've got lots and lots of questions, is to kind of evolve it into the de facto technology committee. Because I think a lot of this competition with China will come in the form of technology competition. I'd argue that the two things where we've kind of already woken up to this was, one, I say this as a former wireless guy, was the 5G competition. Huawei trying to recognize there need to be more Western competitors, and again, kind of after the fact. And I think we're making some progress there as we go into the next generation of that technology called O-RAN. The other, which is much more kind of debated about, was semiconductors. Again, an area where America and our friends around the world were far ahead in the 90s, owned those fields, but had allowed that lead to actually disappear. And I think the competition will be in these technology domains. I'm sure we're going to talk about my Restrict Act and the efforts around TikTok. But I think it's where we would hopefully have a holistic approach, not kind of the whack-a-mole, Kaspersky, Huawei, TikTok. We need a rules-based approach on competing technologies. But we're also going to have to, and one of the reasons why the CHIPS implementation is so important, because if we screw it up, there won't be that appetite again. And we may need similar type investments in quantum computing, in advanced energy, in synthetic biology, which I'm desperately trying to learn more about. And one of the ones that is particularly concerning to me and daunting to me is AI, as I've gone from kind of being a skeptic to a believer to a holy heck view of the potential that technology offers, not only in our country and in democracies, but particularly if there was an authoritarian-based AI technology application that kind of won the day. So lots to unpack in that if you'd like, but it really is something that I want our committee to keep focusing on. I've always claimed the Intelligence Committee was the last functioning bipartisan committee. Mm-hmm. And while I've seen my good friends Mike Turner and Jim Himes start to restore that at HPSCI, it was sometimes more fun when there was a greater contrast. But why don't I stop there so we can make sure I get to plenty of questions.
All right, great. Well, thank you. So I'll start with a few questions, and then we'll move to reporters around the room. So on TikTok, in congressional testimony on Thursday, the CEO is expected to say that the app now has about 150 million users in the U.S., the suggestion being that it's so entrenched in our lives that it can't be reined in. What's your response to that?
I disagree. I mean, I think the challenge with TikTok is twofold, and the 150 million users. I think the last data I've seen it said 140, so push it up to 150. But what's really, I think, concerning to me is of that 150, roughly 100 million are regular users, 90 minutes a day. Most of your media outlets would love to have 90 minutes of eyeballs a day on your publication. And there's a twofold concern I have. One is that the data that is being collected, regardless of the assurances from the company, I think we've seen from whistleblowers to lots of oops, we made a mistake. That data I don't think is safe. And again, let's go back to China's PRC's laws. In 2016, the Communist Party put in place by law that every company at the end of the day owes its first obligation to the Communist Party, not to shareholders, not to customers. So this notional idea that the data can be made safe under CCP law just doesn't pass the smell test. Secondly, and this is where I'm even more concerned, and that's its ability to be a propaganda tool. The TikTok that Chinese kids get, it operates under a different company, is a site that advocates science and engineering and studying hard and being a good citizen. The stuff our kids get, not so much. And the evidence of that as well is in terms of manipulation. I got to do a little more research on this. Is when, and so I put a caveat by this one because I need to make. I've been told about it, but I got to get it locked down. Was that in the aftermath of the death of Queen Elizabeth, that TikTok was flooded with huge numbers of videos about how she was an imperialist and the demise of kind of Western thought. And again, I think there's a huge propaganda basis here. Now, the point that you can't find an alternative, I absolutely believe that there would be video alternatives that would meet that same need, whether it's an American company, whether it's an Indian company, whether it's a French company. And this is not some American Congress only effort. Canada's banned on official devices. Canada has, the EU has, Britain, I think, announced just literally in the last 10 days. India never allowed TikTok in the first place back in 2019, 2020. So this concern, I think, really is valid. And one of the things that my bill does, and we started with 12 senators, 66 Rs. We're up to 18, I think, so it's 9 and 9 at this point. To get 18 senators to agree on anything evenly divided is, I think, a task. I think we will have a substantial more in the coming weeks, and Speaker McCarthy's indicated, at least in the press, that he thinks this is potentially a good approach. I think our key here, though, is to put in place a rules-based approach, not just for TikTok, but for technologies that threaten national security that come from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. So I think we've got a framework that makes sense. I think that the market will create an alternative, and I think the evidence is mounting. I'm not saying they are manipulating that now, but that potential, you don't want to do it after the fact, after the harm has been done. And last point on this is just that one of the things that it is incumbent, so there's not kind of to the public or the press, this notion of, hey, if the government trusts us, what our bill does is to try to make sure as well that the intel community lean as far forward as possible in declassifying as much information as possible about any of these technologies so that we earn that trust. So, again, I think about Huawei, where we didn't declassify enough on the front end. American companies, small telcos, bought Huawei. Europeans did. Now we're spending taxpayer money to rip out the equipment, because if you look at where Huawei was sold and where intercontinental ballistic missile sites were, it was almost 100% overlay. And country after country are ripping it as well, because, again, we didn't lean forward enough on the vulnerabilities.
All right, I'll do one more. I know there's lots to follow up on there, but I just wanted to ask you about the banking situation. Mm-hmm. So you've stuck by your support for the 2018 law that rolled back some of the regulations on mid-sized banks. But based on where things stand now, what reforms are needed to shore up the banking system?
Listen, and let me be clear. We need to figure out what happened. And if there were things that happened in 2018 that helped create this crisis, I'm wide open to making changes. I'm absolutely supportive of what the President suggested on the FDIC in terms of clawing back executive comp. But what and again, the Fed's supposed to have their first round of review done in 6 weeks. I think it's down to 5 weeks now. Mm-hmm. If you look at capital requirements, at least all the evidence so far, this was not a case of increased capital requirements would have prohibited this or would have stopped it. I think this was a liquidity crisis. And what I find unconvincing is that somehow that some stress test alone would have spotted this. This was basic prudential regulation failure, it appears. And whether this was a $5 billion bank or a $500 billion bank, if you see a tripling in its deposits over a 3-year period, combined with a single industry focus, the way SVB had with technology, and you have basic interest rate mismatch, you go long on securities as interest rates go up. I mean, to somehow say the only way to catch that is a stress test, I think undermines the confidence we ought to have in basic safety and soundness prudential regulation that is banking regulation 101. But again, let's get the facts before you come up with a solution. Before you have the facts. And then the second part of this, and I don't have an answer on it, other than the fact that we've never seen a run at this speed before. If you think back to the last major banking crisis, WAMU, $16 billion of deposits leaving over a 10-day period. This was $42 billion in 6 hours. Frankly, started by some irresponsible VCs crying the equivalent of fire in a crowded theater Wednesday night and Thursday morning. Now, I'm not sure that's illegal, but it sure is immoral. And when you suddenly have a run on a bank that would, by the time Thursday come around, to basically 25 cents on a dollar for every dollar in the bank, I'm not sure how that is stopped. I mean, I show my age when I always do my "It's a Wonderful Life" comparisons here, but no, your money's over there in that house, or your money's in that company. I do think I would like to figure out if there were players here who played the Mr. Potter role in the crisis. But I think that question and needs to be invested. But what it raises, and I am again, it raises the issues of what happens to uninsured deposits in any small and mid-sized bank going forward. And again, I hope people don't lock themselves into one position or another till we fully think that through, because this notion, while we did insure total deposits from the crisis in 2008 till 2012, I mean, that's a big leap, but it's something that, when you got a model on particularly mid-sized banks, why would you keep money there as opposed to putting it in a SIFI bank if there's not some assurance about your deposits? All
right, so one more on the banking thing, on the campaign contributions to you or a super PAC that supports you. So your campaign received around at least $27,000 in the last cycle.
No, I don't think that. I think that's
is that not true?
I think it goes back from. I've had some support from this bank since 2014. I think that's the all-in over about a decade. Here's my feelings. Listen, I have never been influenced by campaign contributions on any issue. Dead stop. Secondly, if there was malfeasance, of course I'm going to turn it back. I'll give it to charity. But let's get our facts first. But it sure does appear. Let me say this. I have said this publicly. Where was the bank management? Where were the regulators? We're going to have this information very shortly, at least the first blush from. And I think Michael Barr is the right guy with the kind of respect on left and right. But obviously, if there's malfeasance.
So this holds for both SVB and for Becker himself.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if there's malfeasance at all, I'll go to charity or wherever it's the right place to.
All right, Laura Litvin from Bloomberg.
Thank you. Follow up on the banking. One idea that's out there is that some of the mid-sized banks are pushing for now is to have the FDIC insure all deposits above $250,000 for 2 years. Do you support that idea? And more generally, I would kind of want to go back to what she was asking about, like, kind of what's doable here in the divided Congress to respond to this.
I think people I've been impressed with Chair McHenry. I think he's had he's had a sober voice. I think there's been some on both sides of the aisle who've, gone back to their political talking points. In terms of the above the uninsured deposits level at 250, I'm open to that. I don't want to rush because to take that leap is a big leap. It does raise some moral hazard issues. And I also think that, could this be an FDIC insurance, changing the rates so that if you want above 250, you have to pay more in. There ought to be some assessment here. If you are single sector focused, maybe you have a high rate. Maybe there's a way. Some people have suggested a private sector insurance above 250. I don't know whether. I'd love to see that. I'm not sure with the kind of black swan events that could take place, whether, as we saw even back in the 2008 crisis, we had mortgage insurance until we didn't because there was the losses were so great. But it does, this issue really does raise that model for those mid-sized banks, and I'm talking, if you don't have something here, are you going to have this massive further consolidation because everybody's going to say, I need my money deposits to be absolutely safe, and the only place would be, the literally top 2 or 3 SIFI banks. I think that probably wouldn't hurt a lot of the very small community-based banks because the overwhelming majority of deposits there fall in that insured category. But this is a big issue, and I was kind of nervous over the weekend. I had calls with a bunch of folks. This week could still be choppy with some of these mid-sized banks, and people I think conflate the Credit Suisse problems have been around for a long time. This has been kind of the fact that it is exploded at this moment may conflate in people's minds.
Is it just a pure coincidence?
Well, no, I don't think it's a pure coincidence, but there were plenty of documented issues about Credit Suisse for years.
Right. Let's see, Lauren?
Yeah, it's Lauren Fedor.
Lauren Fedor from the FT.
I just want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned briefly about what the president was talking about at the end of last week. Would you be in support of clawing back the bonuses from these executives, in addition to the gains that they might have had from share sales? There's also some discussion about banning these people from working in banking again. Is it fair to say that you support all those ideas?
I support the FDIC, clawback provisions. I want to take a look at the president's specific proposal. I believe I went ahead. Rachel, I think I signed on already on the Blumenthal bill that's out there. But I'm making sure that inappropriate behavior is sanctioned. I'm all in on. But again, I think what we ought to do is I start with the premises. Why wasn't there a risk officer? Why was there not a risk officer 8 months of the last 12 months of the year? Where was the regulator on traditional safety and soundness? But it was because I think some of these things, both in terms of growth and in terms of some of the interest rate mismatch, traditional safety and soundness, is what I keep coming back to. That is banking regulation 101. Some of these things should have been spotted. But the flip of that, though, is that having had conversations with some of the most central people, this was not something that had been on a lot of people's radar screens before literally the middle of the preceding week.
Can I just ask one other thing when you talk about it could be rocky this week for the regional banks? Just how worried are you that things might get worse?
Well, I'm implicit in what the president said, and maybe others should have reinforced this, was your money's safe for at least the next year. Your deposits are safe. So these kind of mid-size, if there's any runoff taking from these mid-size banks, is deposits go to larger institutions. That's kind of psychology. It shouldn't be based on actual fear, but I do worry about what happened on First Republic. I think we'll have to be watching that. Zions, PAC, some of the ones that got called out on ratings. But if you have this seismic sea change where, short of a permanent deposit guarantee, people who have money above the 250 or above whatever number are going to move to money center banks, that changes the model. And it's not, and what I worry about is that the kind of normal, well, if we just move from 250 to 500 or even to $1 million, what does that do to the mid-size businesses who have more than that kind of capital in some of these banks? Just because they want a banking relationship where they feel closer to if they're a regionally based company, to a regionally based bank. It really is a niche that a lot of your community banks doesn't do, but people have used those regional ones as a model that they didn't want to have a SIFI bank. And I think we'll see how that plays out this week.
All right. John Gizzi from Newsmax.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Senator, for coming. Putting on your hat as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, will you ask, is there growing sentiment within the administration and on Capitol Hill among supporters of Ukraine to have President Zelensky sit down and negotiate with President Putin? And I have a follow-up question on that.
You mean President Putin, who was indicted last week for war crimes? Is that President Putin?
Yep, same guy. By the ICC. By
the ICC, a court that neither Russia or the United States acknowledges or adheres to. I think the public position of the administration and of our European other allies around the world with Ukraine, that the time and place for negotiations ought to be set by the Ukrainians is the correct position. I also believe that, as we get into spring and the much anticipated counteroffensive, how it materializes is going to be absolutely critical. And I do not think it is in the best interest of the United States, or for that matter, democracies around the world, when you've got wannabe American national leaders somehow say that fail to recognize that the territorial integrity of Ukraine, maintaining that, is frankly in the nation's interest, and a Putin that is successful in Ukraine threatens the Baltics, Poland, and other NATO nations, and encourages Xi's potential aggression towards Taiwan. And naivete or of some, again, wannabe leaders in this country is really pretty shocking.
All right. As a follow-up question on that, then do you support, and your colleagues on the committee, Ukraine regaining all of its territory going back to Crimea, which was seized in 2014?
I think there are I understand the Ukraine's leadership's aspirational goals, but let's see where things stand after the offensive.
All right, Warren Strobel from the Wall Street Journal.
Senator, you started off talking about great power competition and sort of the wrong turn into Iraq 20 years ago. Can you give us your sense the extent you can publicly about how the intelligence community, particularly CIA, is dealing with China and Russia. We all know China is a really hard target, ubiquitous surveillance, authoritarian. You have 1 million technological and military developments you need to keep up. One could argue that Russia may be hypothetically an easier target now. You have power centers, people who are unhappy with Putin, the FBI and CIA have been openly saying, come talk to us. So,
yeah, great questions. I think Russia has been a traditional target, and we've spent 70 years now trying to figure out how to penetrate and understand, and we've got lots of help from other nation states who are concerned about Russia as well. China, much more difficult to penetrate. You remember, this is in the public domain. Chris Wray indicated, the FBI starts 10 new counter-espionage cases against China every day. And frankly, China is a harder target, number one. Number two, I'm of an age where we always grew up with a concern and view Soviet Union / Russia as a potential adversary. We didn't have that vis-a-vis China. And matter of fact, I was part of the absolute conventional wisdom theory of the case in the early parts of the 20th. I remember going to China as a governor and encouraging all these deals and university and collaboration, cross collaboration, with the premise that the closer we bring the PRC into the international order, the more they're going to operate like the balance of the world. And particularly with the rise of Xi, we were just wrong. I mean, I would sit in all of these Intel hearings, and every week hear another horror story about what was happening, from intellectual property theft to the kind of joint ventures where this giant sucking sound of technology being exploited, the investments China was making. And then I go and look at my business friends who are all saying, gosh, can't miss this market. What they're doing to the Uyghurs may be bad, or more recently, that's pretty bad about the people of Hong Kong, but can't miss that market. So we have, I think there's been a beginning of a sea change, both in terms of business waking up to the fact that the price of doing business in China is meaning your intellectual property is being stolen, and you are basically there until the CCP can figure out a way to mimic your product, and then you're going to get kicked out. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that is and this is in my mind, if I leave you with no other thought, it is that national security in 2023 is different than it was in 2003 and 1993. It is increasingly a technology competition. Who has the most tanks, guns, and planes is not going to be the determinant. It is going to be who is the most successful in telecommunications, in advanced energy, in synthetic biology, in quantum computing, artificial intelligence. And our spy services are not that used to, we're used to spying on tanks, ships, and guns and government officials. Maybe measuring PRC's investments in cobalt mines in the DRC has not traditionally been an intelligence priority. But it needs to change, and I think it's changing. And one of the things that I've been working really hard on, I want to give credit to Bill Burns and Avril Haines, Paul Marcassoni, and Gina Raimondo, because we, by definition of the IC, that you have to look out and can't look in. So I go, talk to analysts in the IC, and they may have good ideas on, what is I'm a wireless guy, so I'm a little bit of a tech nerd. What's the next generation wireless going to look like? And they can talk about Chinese investment here or there. And I say, well, what do we got? What's our competitor here? But they don't even have the knowledge of a first-year Goldman analyst because they can't look domestically. So how we marry this, both looking domestically and looking out, in a way that realizes we sure as heck don't want American intel entities looking at American enterprises, is really, I think, one of the issues of the day. And if we don't, and this is why CHIPS is so important. I mean, CHIPS is quasi-industrial policy. And if we hadn't done it, there would never have been another fab built in America. And if we hadn't done it, there wouldn't have been the advanced equipment and all the other pieces that go along this supply chain wouldn't have happened. But boy, oh boy, if we don't get it right, the ability to do like-kind major investments in other technology domains that fall into national security will be seriously undermined. And that case for our intelligence community about a shift of assets and how we figure this out is really, really hard.
Annette Meiritz from Handelsblatt, which is the Wall Street Journal of Germany, right?
Well, I hope it's
kind of.
Thank you for this introduction. Thank you for taking my question. I have a quick follow-up on Ukraine and one question on Huawei and the European Union. So on Ukraine, can you share any new details from the intelligence community, what you're able to share on the sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? There have been articles about that it might have been a Ukraine group sabotaging this pipeline. Do you have any new details you can share? How likely is it that it was in fact a Ukraine group? And what would that mean for the ongoing Ukraine aid from the U.S.?
I have no new details.
Okay, and how likely from your point of view is it that it was a Ukraine group?
I have no new details to share.
Okay. On Huawei quickly, so you mentioned there was a kind of a nice picture in my head that the European Union is ripping out the Huawei systems or Huawei technology out of their systems. So, but
that was more America. There's not, but many countries,
yes,
including Germany, have started to rethink.
Yes, they started to rethink. But my question is, what makes you so sure that crucial partners like Germany and the European Union actually distance themselves from Chinese companies like Huawei? My outlets, we are coming out with a story this week that pretty much shows the opposite, that mobile carrier companies, for example, intensified their ties with Huawei instead of respecting the U.S. sanction. I'm happy to share more details with your office, but more broadly, how satisfied are you with the efforts?
Well, here, we started these efforts, Richard Burr and I did in about 2017, 2018, I think. And there was no coherent American policy at that point. You know, we literally, from our committee, brought all the pieces of the U.S. government together to think this through, number one. Number two, we had, in America in particular, at least, had kind of fallen asleep at the switch on this issue. And again, I don't want to go too nerdy. Since I was in the wireless industry for years, I can get really, really nerdy on Ericsson, Nokia are great, companies, but their equipment was much more expensive than Huawei. Huawei, pretty good, cheap equipment, and it was financed on terms that were not business-based finance. It was, let me, in effect, give you the system. And we, the American, for a while, I can remember many of my European friends saying, "Okay, Warner, I get this, but what do you want us to buy instead?" There was not an alternative. And until, like I remember the Brits, and Huawei was done very good in the UK in terms of hiring senior British politicians to help make the case. But I think as your services and our friends in my 5 and my 6 when in CHQ went deeper in, there are back doors. So what I have supported, and it's where I think a place like Germany, the more we can move to kind of a stacked hardware-based system, which is Ericsson, Nokia, and Huawei, to what's called Open RAN, the next generation beyond 5G, more software-based. That's where German software companies, American software companies can come in and create a new entity to be competitive. Last point on this. So we've got work to do. But one of the things that was also a wake-up call to me, and this is one where I think there was interest from friends in Germany and elsewhere, is that it's one thing for the CCP to have a company like Huawei if it was just a one-off. But one of the things that had happened almost since Sputnik was that the United States, with our allies, regardless of where the next new invention was invented, where we dominated in many ways was in the standard-setting bodies and the protocols and procedures that set the rules for each of these technologies. And setting the rules, that's kind of nerdy stuff. Your eyes are all glazing over. But setting the rules also builds your values in. Are you going to build in transparency? Are you going to preclude backdoors? And what's happening in 5G was China was basically flooding the zone on these international standard-setting bodies. And I think one of the things that, and you do not want the CCP setting the standards and the rules for artificial intelligence. I can't think of a more frightening notion that we're going to allow technology with authoritarian bents to kind of have no rules of the road. So I think this kind of collaboration we need, and even how we talk about an alliance. I mean, when you use terms like, and people, many of my colleagues, I try to be a little sensitive to this. Even when you use a term like the West, you offend 2/3 of the world that ought to be with us. So whether we go back to the free world or versus the, I don't know what the right frame is. We need our friends in Africa. We need our friends in South America. We need, lots of South Asia. We need this alliance of the willing around technology collaboration. And it cannot be an American only. If it comes back to this kind of bipolar, by Chinese or by American, that is not a winning circumstance.
All right, so suddenly we're running out of time, and we have a lot of questions to go. Theo Meyer from the Washington Post.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for doing this. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about and update us on your conversations around the debt limit, around potential efforts, to diffuse it with other, more centrist members of the Senate.
Maybe I ought to go back to Nord Stream. Listen, as somebody who's been a proud member of every gang since the Simpson Bowles Gang of Six, and our gang record has gotten a lot better the last couple of years. I can completely drive you all crazy if I start going into debt numbers and how we need to make sure our entitlement programs are sustainable over the future. So I know there's an issue, but I don't want to be party at this point in enhancing bad behavior around the debt ceiling. So, I'm not going to be part of some effort, and I think the vast majority of the regular suspects are not part of any effort at this point when, the debt ceiling, which is a made-up political hand grenade used irresponsibly, and boy, oh boy, I can't think of a worse time to use it irresponsibly than with international issues and with some of the banking issues than now. So I think we do need to get to this point where it is resolved, and being pretty aware of what's going on. I'm not saying everybody's in this camp, but the traditional bipartisan gang members, at least on the Democratic side, for the most part, are saying, hey, no, we can come back and talk about all these things, but let's get through the debt ceiling first, without tying the two.
What about when it comes to budget negotiations that, at least in theory, could be somewhat separate from the debt limit itself?
Well, the budget negotiations, for better or for worse, you got Biden's budget out there. You got to have a counter proposal, and I think on this one I give the White House full credit. Mr. Speaker, show us your stuff, and then you got to live with it.
Jessica Stone from VOA.
Yes, I had two questions related to TikTok. The first is, you mentioned earlier about declassification of more information to better educate the public, and I know that you can't do that right this second, but I wonder, other than the 2016 law that you referred to, what is the best publicly shareable evidence you have that TikTok is already doing harm to
what I would just do, within the public domain, I would go back and cite mostly media reports, whether it was BuzzFeed or whether it was some of the whistleblowers, about the fact that they keep, TikTok management keeps saying, oh, don't worry, we're going to keep your data safe. When Chinese law dictates that it is not safe, CCP can demand it at any point. And plenty of examples where you kind of get from TikTok management, oops, or, oh, yeah, maybe we were using TikTok data to follow certain journalists. Plenty of that dictated out there. And then, in terms of the ability for content manipulation or propaganda, look at the TikTok version the Chinese kids see versus the TikTok that the rest of the world sees. That shows the power if you control the algorithm. And it's one of the reasons why I am concerned that even with divestiture, if the source code remains in Beijing and the updates come from Beijing, I don't know how you make it safe. This was this is where the issue was on Huawei. It wasn't that Huawei was a current active threat. It was the proof that, oh my gosh, you got a back door there, and in the normal course of business, if every day or every week you were sending dozens of updates, at any point any of those updates can have that virus malfeasance tool put in that can be utilized.
Another question, is Secretary Raimondo on record talking about the political costs of banning TikTok? Are you confident that
I
she
am.
will?
I have.
That she will.
Ian and I are great friends, and I am 100% confident. Although I will expect her to call some of my colleagues to reiterate that. I sat in meetings with her when some of these issues were explored. Now, is it a political reality that's pop? Yeah, and I'm not saying all of a sudden. I want to. I've seen TikTok. It's not like. There's a lot of creativity going on there, and I think there is a market desire for an active, algorithm-driven video streaming entity. I think the market will create that, and then some people rightfully will say, "Well, gosh, and I do think there is a nature of a difference when a company is at least indirectly controlled by an authoritarian regime versus because I got problems with Facebook and Google and Amazon. I got Section 230 reforms. I've been trying for years on the basic question of dark patterns. When you get on you can never say anything but yes. So I've been very disappointed that we've not even within American-based tech companies put some rules of the road in places. But I do think there's a fundamental difference when at the end of the day. As we saw with Google, they don't answer the American government. I think back to Project Maven, whereas I don't think you can make that claim on TikTok.
Okay, Morgan Chalfant from Semaphore.
Thanks for taking my question. I wanted to ask you about the subject. It gives the Commerce Secretary a good deal of power. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about why you structured it the way that you did.
Yeah. Okay.
And then also if you can update us on any conversations you've had with the House. I know you mentioned the Speaker.
Yeah. I have not spoken to the Speaker directly, but there were some. Either you or Punchbowl said you guys. He said some very nice things, and I intend this week to have conversation with some of my House Republican friends on this. Number one, and I think again, one of the things we have heard repeatedly from business and others is. The idea that some have had of let's name a specific application in law. I don't think that's the right approach because I've even had, I think Senator Paul said that might have been a bill of attainder and could be unconstitutional. I also think you need a rules-based approach that other countries, if they wanted to put in place as well, could stand scrutiny. The naming an individual company by law, I think, invites retaliation. Number one. Number two, these conversations started with NIST and others about how we would. I'm sorry, NTIA and others, because the challenge, and this goes back to IESA, which was the underlying law that has been used. There was an underlying law that Trump used in an EO that Biden expanded on that frankly didn't get past muster. And there was something called Berman amendments because there is a higher level of scrutiny when it's a communications technology. TikTok may be a Chinese-owned entity, but they still have First Amendment rights as that corporate form. So we created a whole new set of authorities. Give it to the Secretary of Commerce. That was where all of the legal and kind of subject matter experts we turned to said was the best place. Had extensive conversation with the Secretary of Commerce. And again, we would give that position a suite of tools up to and including banning, but could be divestiture, could be other restrictions. And again, I think we need. My hope is this is the right solution for TikTok, but more broadly, it is the right solution for foreign-based technology from adversarial nations that harm our national security interests. And we ought to be proactive rather than the kind of, I keep using the term, whack-a-mole reactive, which has been our path. There was Kaspersky, the Russian software company, then it was Huawei, then it was ZTE, now it's TikTok. Who knows what next year or the year after will hold. So let's put a framework in place.
All right, Pat Zingerle from Reuters.
Hi. I was wondering, to get back to the banking issue, in the aftermath of this, who do you think would be good? What kind of people would be good to get in to give testimony? Regulators, bank executives, anybody else I'm not thinking of?
I think we will need regulators, banking experts. I mean, I'm happy to, I think there is real questions of, whether it was the 2018 law or there's some other set of rules that could have prevented this or spotted this earlier. I still believe that, I'm pretty familiar with what safety and soundness and prudential regulation ought to look like. I'm proud that Bob Corker and I were the authors of at least Title I and Title II of Dodd-Frank, where we did a lot of this resolution activity. I think Dodd-Frank was the right framework. And, kind of my operating premise today is bank management should have spotted this, and basic prudential regulation should have spotted this. Because if it didn't, then it undermines my confidence in any bank regulation, because, again, I don't care whether it's a $5 billion bank or a $500 billion bank. In terms of who else should come in terms of testimony, those are the those would be my first set of suspects. But let me think about it. Maybe if I can come up with some specific names that would be outside. I also think that there is, and this is, I raised this with Secretary Yellen last week. I raised a question, but I don't know if there's, I can't think of, at least at this point, on what remedy. But the idea that whatever set of regulatory rules you had in place, if you have an internet-driven run where 25 cents on every dollar comes out of an institution in less than 1 day, what possible protection could there be? And I do wonder again whether some of the folks who sparked the run, I want to make sure there was not any short selling or any whether they're making it on both sides of the fence, and there was more than a little hypocrisy of some of my, and I say this as a former venture capitalist, some of my libertarian, VCs who were all for libertarian government out of my hair until they weren't.
Right. Julian Barnes from the New York Times.
It seems to me that most of the evidence about TikTok is a potential national security threat as opposed to a proven national security threat. And I wonder also if the theory of the case here is, do you think that TikTok turns teenage brains to mush any more than Instagram turns teenage brains to mush? And aren't we just going to have teenage brains being turned to mush by an American company? Is that the theory here, that only American companies can change brains?
I think you may be at least partially right on both your presumptions. But you remember, on Huawei, our actions were taken not because of real-time exfiltration of data, but because of the potential harm to be done. And when you're talking about a tool, remember China has been publicly accused of the OPM breach, the Equifax breach, the potential of whether it's 100 or 150 million young Americans, data being collected for years. Do we really want to wait to see the potential of that, exploitation of that, before we say, oh my gosh, there could be harm? Or the ability to suddenly say, we're going to have a messaging about Taiwan that's coming out of the CCP that comes into these innocuous videos. I think that potential is of great enough harm, and that we need to act. Now, is your other premise that does that somehow mean that American companies aren't creating like-kind harm? You're right. But I do think from a national security standpoint, there are differences when that harm originates from a nation state that by law says any company in that nation state's first allegiance has to be the Communist Party of China, not to shareholders or customers. That is a fundamentally different problem. In terms of American companies, I'd love to send you, Julian, all 8 or 9 pieces of my legislation, almost all bipartisan, none of which is advanced, that does, let me give you one of the most basic, data portability, interoperability. If you're tired of Facebook or Instagram, just as it used to be really hard to move from one photo to another, you got to be able to move your data easily. So as a parent, you can say, well, don't go on this site, go on this site, and you still can talk to the people on the other site, or to the dark patterns, or the Section 2 through 30 reforms. So I'm concerned about the American enterprises in terms of our kids' brains turning to mush. I'm concerned in a different, more visceral, real way from a national security basis about a CCP controlled, indirectly controlled entity.
All right. We've got 3 minutes left. Can we squeeze in 2 more quick ones?
No, I can go. Today through the grace of Leader Schumer, we're not in session today.
So
I can do 5 more minutes.
I can do 5. All right, we won't keep you too long.
No, I won't take too long, but I also know I talk too long. So.
All right, Allison Pecorin from ABC.
Hello.
Hey.
I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction than we've been, but I wanted to talk briefly about the classified documents issue. We saw kind of I don't want to say unusual, but a strong show of bipartisanship from your committee, you and Vice Chair Rubio.
And every other member of the committee.
And every other member of the committee, really arguing that the administration's handling of making these documents available to y'all was unacceptable to you. We saw you guys get that briefing from DNI Haynes, and there were some really serious threats from Republicans, particularly about stalling out floor proceedings over this. We haven't really seen any of that bear. But I am wondering where those conversations stand now and whether we should actually expect any sort of hold-up on the floor or otherwise related to this.
The administration's position is untenable. It doesn't pass any kind of smell test. That if there was a violation made by President Trump, President Biden, or Vice President Pence about mishandling of documents, that ought to be pursued. I got no interest in that. But to say that the congressional oversight of the intelligence community can't proceed, because I'm concerned not only about the documents, but what has been done, if anything, to mitigate. Now, I think the briefing was successful in the sense that I at least got a sense of what a lot of these documents are. There's a whole bunch of them that, frankly, might have been executive work products or something that we don't have. Not my job, not our responsibility. Others, I think we did make progress, and we got some indications of some of the mitigation process. I think the administration understands. I think this responsibility lies at the Department of Justice. We are quick to point out that there was Bob Mueller investigation going on, and we saw raw intelligence. Richard and I, Senator Burr and I did during the last investigation. I'm hoping for progress this week.
Thank you.
I'm not saying solution. I'm hoping for progress.
Right. Krista Case-Bryant from the Monitor, to your right.
I just wanted to touch on the question of COVID origins. It's interesting to me that 3 years after 9/11, we had a bipartisan national commission issue a big, long, heavy report about everything that happened and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. And 3 years after the pandemic started, we have a 17-page intelligence report. Now, granted, most people would agree this was not a deliberate attack as 9/11 was, but the toll is just so much more significant. And I'm wondering what your sense is of why, and I know, there's been this push to declassify more intelligence, but what's your sense about why we haven't gotten to the bottom of that? And is it because it's like, well, this is an issue for virologists to decide, or Dems are concerned about, Republicans trying to rake Dr. Fauci over the coals for everything he did about masks and vaccinations and other things that aren't related to this question?
No, I think this was, again, if you think I am overstating the case on technology competition or TikTok, it's, what's the word I want to use? I mean, it's awful, doesn't seem like the right word, but it's awful that you've got one of the world's leading powers, and the CCP has been completely opaque to the international community being able to come in and source this. It's the height of irresponsibility. This is not leadership. And so the idea that, oh my gosh, well, if something happens on TikTok or something happens in AI, if they set the rules, they're going to be transparent? No. This is totally irresponsible leadership from the PRC, and I think it is, frankly, combined with shoddy products and bad financing, even with Belt and Road Initiatives, has given the kind of the American and his friends a real chance to reset this argument with the PRC. And my feeling all along on this has been, let's follow the evidence. And, I accepted what the experts said at first. Remember, not having people on the ground there, that it was wet market. I've probably become more convinced now that it was, if you asked me 10 days ago, that it might be a lab error, although not intentional. Although, if you look, people will say, well, you got DOE and FBI saying lab. If you look into what they've said, they cite different labs. And then you have last week, which was, another report saying, what was the animal? It was some weird
raccoon dog.
I don't even know what a raccoon dog is.
It's a really big raccoon.
It's a really big, but this all begs the question that if you are a major international power, you have an obligation, I think, to, just in terms of health of the planet, to be more transparent. We know one thing, whether it was the lab or a wet market, and, at the end of the day, my gut is it probably came from a lab, but I don't know. I'm going to follow the evidence. But the idea that you want to be accepted as an international leader and something that kills close to 7 million people, and you're not going to be transparent about letting other scientists in to see the sourcing, is the height of your responsibility.
But do you think it's mainly China's responsibility, or do you see Congress as having a responsibility? And if
I think at the end of the day,
why do you think? Because I've seen a real discrepancy between the energy and momentum on the Republican side about wanting to get to the bottom of this question, or saying that that's what they want to do, and Dems just being very quiet and not engaging.
Well, I don't. I hear. I hear a lot of people doing press releases, but I don't think. I think that the group of experts that were put together, that were tasked, I've met with experts from the national labs on this subject. I think it is frankly not fair at all to say these scientists didn't do their best. But if you don't have access to source materials, and it's all second and third hand, that seriously impugns a scientific review. And I am all for finding the source of this. I will try to do anything other, but do you really advance the ball if you make some political press release? What I'd say is, let's force these labs and that market to be open to international inspection. I don't know how short of that we're ever going to find. And I frankly think it is grossly unfair to say that the scientists who have spent all this time investigating aren't doing it up to the best of their ability. And if you've got any evidence of that, or if you can point to any of the Republicans and give any evidence of scientists trying to hide the ball or not following it, give it to me. But if not, don't repeat these spurious claims.
Right. Thank you. All right. Well, listen, we have gone into overtime, and I think we'll end.
Well, let me not end on a hot note. Let me
You have something uplifting to end.
Yeah.
There's so much uplifting.
Yeah. Why did Adam Sandler do 27 minutes of acceptance speech last night? No.
What was his best joke?
Well, he didn't.
He wasn't funny?
Dana Carvey and Chris Rock were both really funny. And when it shows up on CNN next week, I can't imagine either part of their monologues will be in the public viewable. Mm-hmm. And here will be the last point I want to make is that, and you guys, I think know this, or you obviously do know it, but the point I try to make to folks around Virginia or elsewhere is, I've been here 14 years now. Starting with the kind of the gang at the end of the Trump administration, where we call it the 908 bill, where a bunch of us said, all right, we're tired of the baloney, and we're going to sit down. We sat down at Lisa Murkowski's house of group rooms. And these last couple of years have been, arguably maybe the first couple of years of Obama, but frankly, I think even more than that, the most productive since I've been here. And virtually everything that happened was bipartisan. So this notion that we're all up here at each other's throat all the time just isn't the case. And whether you go from, the CHIPS bill or the infrastructure bill or, the bill that you guys get but most Americans don't, the Electoral Count Act, God willing, prevent another January 6th, the Veterans bill, the Guns bill, even frankly a lot of the stuff in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, an awful lot. We could have gotten Republican support on all of that except for the pay-fors. So the only thing I would also ask you, I know it's counter to the conventional wisdom storyline, but there's a whole lot of folks on both teams who are actually trying really hard to do what they think is right for the country. And I'll close with where I ended. This week, depending on what she decides to do with Putin vis-a-vis selling arms, could be the most significant thing that's happened in years. And on a longer-term basis, the need for us to make, with our friends, to win the battle around these new technology domains, which offer enormous hope for mankind around the world, is the issue that I hope I can add some value to, and I hope the Intelligence Committee, because of its bipartisan nature, can add some value.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and
so much.
Please come again.
I will.
And
I'll be back.
everybody.
Thank you,
right.
guys.
Thank you.